Yes.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Apologize for the slight delay. We've been having some tech issues. Obviously, Chris Okonkwo wants to talk about Fela Kuti, so we need some sound and we need some video. And we've been having some issues getting that going, but we hope we've got that fixed right now. Welcome, everybody, to the fourth of the 2024-2025 African Literature Association lecture series. My name is Simon Lewis. I am sitting here in surprisingly cold Charleston, South Carolina, with snow still on the ground, and I believe there's even snow still on the ground in the Florida Alps down there in Tallahassee. It's a little unusual for us, but nonetheless, we're coping bravely with this cold weather. I have the honor of serving as the Vice President of the African Literature Association at the moment, and also as the person on the Executive Council of the ALA who's responsible for these lectures and this whole lecture series. If you haven't attended one of them before, just let me take a minute or so to run through the technicalities. We have ourselves here on Zoom. That's myself, Dr. Okonkwo, and our tech wizard, Lexi Langendorf up in Wisconsin. And we are meantime screening live through the ALA YouTube site, which is where everybody should be logged on. Please go ahead and use the chat feature of the ALA YouTube site to let us know where you're logging in from. This has been one of the great features of this lecture series, that it allows us to connect with folks on the continent, in Europe, and all across the United States and Canada, all at the same time. It's a terrific feature. It's one of the best features of this initiative, allowing us to keep in contact with association members outside of the conference gatherings. Another great benefit of the format is that you can put comments as they occur to you in the chat without interrupting the speaker and without forgetting what you wanted to say in response to anything that the speaker might have said. So please, if Dr. Okonkwo says something that snags your attention, please feel free to put something into the chat while he is speaking. He won't actually see those things, but Lexi and I will be monitoring the chat, and we will be copying and pasting subsequently into the chat on Zoom for Dr. Okonkwo to respond to. So I hope those are all reasonably clear as technical arrangements. Let me now introduce today's speaker, who is Professor Christopher Okonkwo. Professor Okonkwo graduated top of his class in 1989 from the University of Nigeria in Nsukka, before coming to the United States for his graduate study. He landed in Tallahassee at Florida A&M, where he did his MA, and then went on from Florida A&M to the Florida State University, FSU, where he completed his PhD. He was immediately snapped up by the University of Missouri in Columbia, where he then subsequently taught for about 20 years. In 2022, FSU lured him back to Tallahassee as a full professor in the English department, specializing in African and African-American literature. He's always in his career taken special interest in the connections between African literature and African-American literature. And in addition to a multitude of peer-reviewed articles and essays, has published 2 groundbreaking books addressing that particular topic. The first one, A Spirit of Dialogue, Incarnations of Ogbanje, The Born to Die in African-American Literature, was published by the University of Tennessee Press in 2008. And more recently, Kindred Spirits, Chinua AchebeandToni Morrison, came out from the University of Virginia Press in 2022. And that won the College Language Association's Book Prize and was a finalist for the 2024 African Literature Association's Best Book Award. Today's lecture, however, picks up on another thread of Dr. Okonkwo's work, his interest in music. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has to say about the representation of Fela Kuti in African literature. And I presume that Fela Kuti basically provided a significant part of the soundtrack of Dr. Okonkwo's childhood and undergraduate years in Nigeria. And at this point, we're now going to try to get to show you a clip about Fela. So I will hand things over to Lexi Langendorf to set that up. And after that, it'll be all over to you, Dr. Okonkwo. But welcome, everybody. And thank you, Dr. Okonkwo, for being here.
A global icon celebrated all over the world? Check. Leader of a political revolution? Check. Prolific composer for your own genre of music? Check. Oh, and Beyonce thinks you're amazing? Check. What musician could possibly be this incredible? I'd like to invite you to the world of Fela Kuti and his music, Afrobeat.
I said, water no get enemy.
Trumpeter Miles Davis said Fela Kuti was a life-transforming artist. Bassist Bootsy Collins said of Fela's band, "We were telling them they are the funkiest cats we ever heard in our life. I mean, I played with James Brown's band, but we were totally wiped out." Afrobeat roots itself in West African rhythms and melody, textually on African verbal art, particularly Yoruba praise poetry, the harmonic backdrops of funk and soul, and the improvised nature of jazz. What makes Afrobeat music so special?
Because of how much it's drawn from, cultural sounds, the traditional rhythms, the traditional chants, and the horns, the arrangements are so focused on groove and rhythm, West African rhythm, instrumental interplay, funk in the most cultural way is what Afrobeat, I think, is.
I like that. Was really well put. The funk in the most cultural way. That's true. I dig that. I dig it. Even if you aren't familiar with Afrobeat, it's likely that you like music that couldn't exist without it. From vibraphonist Roy Ayers, who toured and recorded with Fela, or even Michael Jackson and Rihanna, borrowing vocal chants from Cameroonian artist Manu Dibango. How about Beyonce loving Afrobeat so much, she recorded an entire Fela Kuti-inspired album that was never released. Here's her song, End of Time, which she says has a bass line, percussion, and horns inspired by Fela's Afrobeat. Recently, Nigeria's Burna Boy hit the global scene, notching 2 back-to-back Grammy nominations. He's called Fela Kuti the greatest musician, and you can hear the influence directly in his music.
Still can't see me stopping. I'm still scheming, plotting.
7 minutes later, all don't cool down, brother.
What do you think, in your words, what do you think makes Fela Kuti so inspirational to musicians across the world?
From his compositions and his bravery and his sincerity in never compromising, never selling out.
Wow.
It was all the things you need to be a great composer. So those ingredients is the foundation of the Afrobeat.
So now that we've heard all about Fela Kuti's influence, let's take it back to the 1960s to learn about his musical origins. By the 60s, the African popular sounds that went on to form Afrobeat had been established by musicians from Ghana and other West African countries. The genre fused Yoruba music, highlife, and jazz, and was brought to life in Nigeria with the help of saxophonist Orlando Julius and Fela Kuti's own band, Kula Lobitos. Tony Allen was a legendary drummer who played in Kula Lobitos. His unique style fused American jazz with highlife, and Fela himself said, without Tony Allen, there would be no Afrobeat. Then, in 1969, Fela Kuti and his band went through an evolution. While living in Los Angeles, Fela's group held down a nightly residency at Citadel de Haiti, a small club on Sunset Boulevard. The band did well enough to pack the club regularly, playing covers of popular soul records and jazz standards. But according to Sandra Isidore, his girlfriend at the time, something was missing from their performances. She pointed him toward a different artistic direction. In an interview, Fela said, "Sandra gave me the education I wanted to know. Sandra was my advisor. She talked to me about politics, history. She taught me what she knew, and what she knew was enough for me to start on. This inspired Fela to use his talents for the benefit of his people, just like his mother, Fumilayo Ransom Kuti, who was a women's rights activist back in Nigeria. Fela didn't have the proper permits to stay in the United States. He recorded a live album called Fela 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 before returning to Nigeria. This album signifies the point right before his band came into their signature Afrobeat sound. And compare that sound to Lady, which was recorded just 3 years later. Fela's evolution from club band leader to leading a musical and political revolution with Afrobeat didn't happen overnight. Returning to Nigeria allowed his sound to grow to the Fela Kuti remembered today. So you're probably wondering, what is the Afrobeat sound? A large part of Afrobeat's magic is how it weaves tradition with music to create its own fabric. Call and response, improvisation, and short rhythmic phrases are the common threads pulled from across the African diaspora. While Afrobeat was influenced by American genres, it also influenced them in return. Listen for the tight harmonies in the horns and the syncopated rhythm in Fela's song, Fight to Finish. Many Afrobeat songs use a layering technique by combining different rhythms together to create the groove. Most instruments are playing a 1 or 2 bar phrase at any given moment. When layered on top of each other, they create one wide sound that's constantly moving. Listen to the repetitive patterns played by the guitar, the horns, and the bass in Fela Kuti's song, Yellow Fever. The horns often play the melody of the song, but are also used for call and response with the vocals. Listen to Suffering and Smiling, where the singers are the call and the horns are the response. You'll also find the horns, drums, and other instruments going for long improvised solos. Because of this, Afrobeat songs are long, anywhere from 15 minutes to an entire hour. Listen to Fela improvise on the saxophone in the song Power Show.
Did you know that Amazon has a $50 million fund that they have to pay out every month? And here's how you...
Fela Kuti's long songs are often broken into 2 parts. The first half consists of a jam filled with instrumental solos and no vocals. Then, about halfway through the song, the vocals come in. The lead vocal takes the helm, and the background vocals chime in with call and response chants that reflect the energy of the lead.
Go on, quench. Go on, kill.
Afrobeat music often incorporates political messages into its lyrics. Common themes are anti-colonialism, Pan-Africanism, and anti-war sentiment. Putting a spotlight to the current climate of Africa has been one of Afrobeat's strongest superpowers. For example, in Zombie, Fela sings about Nigerian soldiers mindlessly following the commands of their corrupt government.
Zombie no go unless you tell him to go. Zombie no go stop unless you tell him to stop.
What is one thing you remember most about Fela Kuti?
I mean, he could be funny. He was when it comes to being on the stage, he's a completely different person.
Oh.
He could stop the band in the middle of a concert to, if anybody played the wrong note or was not in tune, to restart the whole groove.
Wow.
He wasn't a conventional father.
It wasn't at all.
After newfound freedom from British colonialism and the Civil War, Nigeria was entering a new phase of its history. By the 1970s, the federal military government assumed control of the country. As a result of the Civil War that ended in January 1970, people went hungry, families lost their homes, and the after effects of colonialism ran amok, with the military holding on to power through October 1979, albeit with other coups. Fela believed the people of Africa could fight against an unjust military regime. He sought ways to couple his music with his newfound activism. This led to the renaming of his band to Africa 70 and the creation of the Kalakuta Republic. Created in 1970, the Kalakuta Republic was a commune he declared an independent state. The Kalakuta Republic was home base for almost all of his 1970s albums, including Gentleman, Fear Not for Man, and Zombie. All of the political passion he held inside was baked into his music here, free from the outside influence of Nigerian government.
In his two-part song, Confusion, he states it plainly: everything's out of control.
When we talk say confusion, everything out of control. When everything out of control.
His ability to politically influence his growing audience became a thorn in the Nigerian government's foot. To slow down his momentum, he was thrown into jail over 200 times.
The Kalakuta Republic was a safe haven to all who chose to fight against the colonial mindset plaguing Africa at the time. In 1977, the Nigerian army burned down the commune in a raid that resulted in his mother's injury, from which she never recovered until her death.
Fela Kuti's legacy is in full effect today, despite the absence of his original stomping grounds.
The yearly Felabration Festival was created by Fela's daughter, Yeni Kuti, and it honors the father of Afrobeat. In New York City, local music venue Shrine is an American tribute to Fela's original performance space, Africa Shrine.
Fela's children have continued on his legacy by evolving Afrobeat with their own musical talents.
His youngest son, Seun Kuti, has taken on the lead role in his father's band, now called Egypt 80.
In their Grammy-nominated album Black Times, you can hear Afrobeat live on while Seun sings about justice for his people.
Struggle music, struggle sound, struggle people, struggle now.
Fela's oldest son, Femi Kuti, continues to pair activism with music and has earned 4 Grammy nominations of his own. Fun fact, in 2017, Femi broke the record for the longest note on a woodwind instrument at 51 minutes and 35 seconds.
This year, Femi teamed up with his son, Made Kuti, to release a joint album called Legacy Plus. In it, Femi preaches about the struggles of his community.
Made's music takes Afrobeat further by blending it with more influence from jazz and a psychedelic feeling that calls back to Fela's 1960s musical roots.
A newsflash, a plane's gone down.
My child is on that plane.
What is the album Legacy Plus about, and how do you intend people to feel when hearing the new album?
It will show how passionate we are about sound, how passionate we are about the message. Nobody helped anybody write anything, and yet the music and the message is so similar. It shows how finely in tune we are. And the legacy is very much, as you said, it's a legacy with everything that has come before us. Fela, my grandfather, we've traced ourselves back to 7 generations of music. It's the plus after the legacy is that it's in continuum. It doesn't end with us. It doesn't start and end with either of us.
Other musicians outside of the Kuti family have also made waves in Afrobeat music.
Artists like Tony Allen, Igbo Taylor, Auntie Balas, Dele Sosimi, Lagbaja, Bola Johnson, and Kokoroko, a collective of star jazz musicians from London creating Afrobeat music.
Carry me, carry me.
Funk's black positive messages from decades ago gave way to the continued artistic and political awakening of the United States, specifically to the global phenomenon that is hip-hop. Hip-hop has a special affinity for Fela, name-checking him frequently.
Black like Fela, man, try. Some man want act to am I.
Damn, I look like Jesus, and my shirt is off. Ooh, I feel like Fela.
I'm in Stellas with my fellas, bumping nothing but Fela Kuti groupies. Tell me put a record on. Have you ever heard of Fela?
Today you might hear the term Afrobeats with an S, sometimes referred to as Afropop or Afrofusion. Rather than a distinct genre, Afrobeats is now an umbrella term to describe popular music from West Africa. What are some things that some people commonly misunderstand about Afrobeat music?
The difference between Afrobeat and Afrobeats, maybe.
I think that's the most common misrepresentation, because it's Afrobeat is very far from the Afrobeat.
Afrobeat has more of
political purpose and inspiration.
Precisely.
Okay,
Yeah.
I hear that.
Afrobeats mixes West African rhythms and harmonic structures with the melodies and sleek production typically found in hip-hop, sprinkling a little extra influence from black music from all over the world: techno, soca, dancehall, and trap music.
I will even say more, it really came out of hip hop, but they now took one of the beats of Afrobeats, which is they take the snare drum from the Afrobeat, which is a very popular groove of many of my father's tracks or my track in the Afrobeat, and it has become the beat of the Afrobeats.
Afrobeats is a fusion of African traditions from all across the diaspora. You might remember Drake's #1 hit, One Dance, from 2016. Drake takes influence from dancehall and Afrobeats, and even collaborated with the Nigerian artist Wizkid.
That's why I need a one dance, got a Hennessy in my hand.
Fem, which means shut up in Yoruba, is a song by Nigerian artist Davido that has seen heavy play as an anthem for the End SARS movement. It's just one example of how the political fervor of Fela's original genre is still alive, tackling the issues of the day as they arrive. Fela Kuti hasn't just inspired pop stars of Nigeria, but pop stars all across the world. Beyonce even paid tribute to Fela in her legendary Coachella performance in 2018. Fela's message of love and pride for his people still rings through his life's works and all that they inspired. What do you think the future of Afrobeat music looks like?
How Fela his music has really gone further. It's ventured much further than we would have thought over the past few years. And it seems every year that goes by, he becomes more popular. It's a similar kind of trajectory, I think, from Western classical music or jazz, that the more time goes by, the bigger it gets, and the more all these subgenres kind of pop out, and it will just grow as a genre of music and become, one of the great, top genres.
Good morning and welcome everybody. I hope you can hear me. My sincere apologies to you for waiting as we walked through our technical glitches. I send you belated Happy New Year greetings. It is a great honor and privilege for me to be invited to speak at this gathering to share with you these prepared, if long, provisional, and sometimes performative notes. My gratitude goes to the ALA and especially to you, Dr. Lewis, for extending me the invitation and for that gracious and flattering introduction. No matter the tenor, texture, or frequency of his articulation, there is flatly no way a major lecture series such as this is annually successfully convened without capable staff support. And so I want to sincerely thank Ms. Farah Bakari and Ms. Lexi Langedorf for all of the administrative and technical assistance behind the scenes. It is a thriller to have the opportunity to share this same platform with distinguished scholars in our field who spoke before me. Delivering the ALA's calendar year's opening lecture is like being the firstborn child of a large, multiracial, multi-ethnic, and multilingual family with lots and lots of responsibility and younger ones looking up to you, thus raising the bar, but also the discord. Ironically and unfortunately, I am a jazz, high life, disco, and gospel-loving middle child. And as such, I very much hope to not funk it up, funk up the forum, to not underwhelm you with nonsense, upside-down teaching, and potentially dampen the sound turnout expected for and from our next speakers. My Igbo people have a key saying that if one prepares a dish and none of the guests comes, you know something is wrong. A major break has occurred in that sacred cultural antiphony. But you showed up. So I thank you for taking the time on your weekend to honor me, my solo presentation, with your presence. Please let that short biopic serve as my Okonkwo, kola nut, and alligator pepper. Sorry, no palm wine. Accept it too as my small overture on my larger-than-life Oriki commanding subject, Fela Kuti, a transcendent, transgenerational, and transcontinental talent, a megastar that frankly needs no lecture riffs, hook, or drum rolls to gently blow his horn, but trumpet it I must. Fela Kuti, Mmụọ Chineke, orchestrating. Fela Kuti, wordsmith, Odogwu, the jelly masquerade of Afrobeat, Fumilayo's son, a most complicated man, issue a laborer's puzzle, whose standard history-registered truths, toughness, and tracks were impervious to the army's flavored and circular smoke screens. In many ways, Fela Kuti and his legend were us, like us. But then again, they are not like us, most deaf. A few housekeeping items before we continue. I'm a little under the weather today and need to apologize ahead of time for any nasal or vocal hiccups. I also playfully tweaked my title a little in postmodernist mode with the contrapuntal insertion understudied to more cleanly signal my discursive pivot point. Revising the publicized synopsis of my talk as a guide for composing, arranging, and bridging my thoughts on the Fela literary cameos, I suddenly felt a strange dread. Although I like it, my original outline that is, I felt like the bird Ikwikwi, the mother owl in Igbo proverb that laments she is terrified by the massive head of her baby, when in fact she gave birth to that owlet. I realized that I had bitten off too much to chew relative to marked time. As a result, I have had to scale back the scope, specifically the section on reconceptualizing intermediality as akuko na egwu, but hopefully not at the expense of substance and clarity on the rest of the subtopics. In addition, because our theme today is Fela, something cautions me that some in the audience would likely know a lot about him. In fact, a whole lot more than I may already be geared up, like taxi driver, like super trooper, ready for Q&A to pepper me with tough, gotcha questions and modulate my riffs, my rhetorical exuberance. So I have a few disclaimers. I may play one or two musical instruments, traditional musical instruments, and may know one or two or three general things about music, but I am not a musician, musicologist, or ethnomusicologist, nor am I a Fela family, Fela, Afrobeat, or Afrobeat scholar, nor have I read cover to cover every publication and interview on Fela, nor have I listened to his entire catalog of songs, nor for that matter, watched all the documentaries, YouTube clips, the Netflix and Showmax videos, or the other musical, theatrical, cinematic, and artistic productions on him. I encourage anyone looking for insightful scholarship on Fela to consult works by Carlos Moore, Michael Veal, Tejumola Olaniyan, Trevor Shoemaker, Shola Olorunyomi, Stephanie Shonikan, Sahid Aderinto, Niyi Koka, Adeshina Folayan and Toyin Falola, and L, the emerging Fela scholar, our own star doctoral candidate, Alaba Ilesami, among many others. They are receiving a comparative study titled Chinua Achebe and Fela Anikulapo Kuti, Revolutionary Consciousness in Music and Literature by P. Chukwuafọ. The likely influence of Fela on generations of Nigerian and African poets, playwrights, graphic designers, filmmakers, actors, and academics is outside the purview of this lecture. And so are possible invocations of Fela in Nigerian, West African, and more broadly, African life writing. I am so looking for the opportunity to gratefully learn more about Fela from you in the audience. As I hinted earlier, many of the views I share with you today are exploratory and thus subject to reassessment. I composited them from ongoing research from my very rough draft of a chapter on Fela in a book project that is really in its early stages. Other parts were extracted from my essay on music in Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie stories, which is forthcoming in Research in African Literatures this summer. That essay includes my attempt to vernacularize the fusion of fiction and music, their intermediality as akuko and egwu, an Igbo phrase that literally translates as storytelling, and music, but it is also a class of high life music. I want to say one or two opening and explanatory words about the term intermediality, around which I have framed this entire presentation. It can be simply said from a conceptual, cultural, disciplinary, epistemic, and even philosophical standpoint, that what we are broadly concerned with are not imaginaries, but rather the age-old kinship, the spirit of dialogue, the kindred spirit, the boundary-erasing interlinkages of stories, storytelling, and music as primordial art forms. In this, our technological age, other modes of creating and communicating, of composing and sharing, other forms of media, as it were, have emerged and are marked by such inextricable interconnectedness, giving rise to an increasing body of cultural, theoretical, and critical formulations and findings on intermediality. In English studies, in the humanities at large, we are likely already acquainted with the related concept, intertextuality, and many, if not most of us, are equally familiar with the intermediality as idea and practice. But for those hearing the term for the first time here, this is how the critic Bernd Genrat breaks it down in his book, Travels in Intermediality, Reblurring the Boundaries. Quote, today's art, creativity, and originality are marked by intermediality and sampling, by a combinatory juxtaposition of genres, media, styles, and surfaces, a rejection of objective history that explores the various connections of aesthetic forms, end quote. Falling under this nexus of relations are, quote, literature, paintings, film, music, digital art, photography, installations, comic books, and more, end quote, he writes. Another scholar, Jerry Smith, has opined on the interplay of novels and music. He says, quote, novelists from every generation, working within every genre, have responded to the power of music by incorporating it into their narratives, by trying to harness its techniques and effects, and by attempting to recreate the emotions that come to be associated with particular musical styles, forms, or text, end quote. That includes African fiction writers, of course. It includes, in our case, the predominantly Nigerian novelist in whose stories and storytelling Fela, in his life story and his music, are invoked and deployed in a variety of contexts and purposes that together constitute what I am loosely calling his cameos in African fiction. I hope to illustrate later in this discussion one or two or three dimensions of these cameos by way of the Fela invocations in Adichie's works, particularly her music-saturated novel Purple Hibiscus, and through a radical, risky, but certainly generative rereading of one of Adichie's most provocative characters, the young but legendary Nsukka priest, music maker, and method man, Father Amadi. Through the medium of music, the technical, performance, socio-cultural, political, and commercial elements of which he studied, mastered and remastered, and reflexively playing himself as well as the role of storyteller, satirist, educator, and humanist, among others, in many of his songs, Fela did what literary artists and what innumerable politically conscious and imperial African authors, including his own cousin, Nobel laureate Wole Soyinka, did and have done for years in fiction. Specifically, when Fela, like his mother, like many African writers, and like other radical artists and thinkers, changed his name, his last name from the slavery and colonization-tinged Ransom Kuti to Anikulapo Kuti, with Anikulapo suggesting his control and constraints over death, little did he know, or perhaps he knew full well, he was being literal, literary prophetic. For Fela is alive, or rather, he has been kept alive. And therein, in that very subject of Fela's aliveness, lies the issue, the critical gap, for me at least, as a literary scholar. The question is not just that, as far as I know, those cameos, those gestures to Fela and his music in our writer's stories have yet to be critically charted, even historicized, theorized, problematized, and/or read in comparative context with other African diaspora, or even European revolutionary and equally contradictory musical figures invoked in, say, other African or diasporic fiction. The pesky issue for me is that for far too long, indeed to this very day, as illustrated in that fantastic Kola Nut and Alligator Pepper biopic we just watched, the grand narratives on Fela's posthumousness, the cultural events and agencies of his possibility and articulation, in short, the prevalent attributions for what Alaba Ilesami aptly calls Fela's life after life, his reincarnation, incarnations, and even deification have tended to slide over and sidestep fiction, African fiction. They have all but ignored, forgotten, or are unaware of the novel's ancillary function as a memory bank, or the site of memory, to repurpose Toni Morrison's wonderful phrase. The master discourses on Fela have instead preponderantly highlighted other life sustainers and memory conservationists. The routinely checked off and saluted agents include, deservedly, Fela's family, especially his daughter Yeni, his sons Femi and Sheon, and grandson Made, his former band members, but also international trademarking record labels, his fellow musicians and Afrobeat protege in Africa, Europe, Canada, United States, and Latin America, concert promoters, painters, museums and museum creators, academics, print, radio and television reporters and culture, DJs, activists, bloggers, Wyclef Jean, Lauryn Hill, Sir Paul McCartney, Steve Handel, Jim Lewis, B.T. Jones, and the electrifying actor Sehar Ngarja, and of course, producer Jay-Z of the Broadway hit musical Fela. Don't forget film stars, including more recently Idris Elba. Everybody, everything, every genre, except media, except lonely fiction, except the hidden figures, African novelist. To help rectify this long playing oversight, or is it a diss? I want to identify here to you together, non-chronologically, and for the very first time, the novelist in question, the 20 writers in whose fiction Fela appears in direct referential, figural, and performance roles. They are Chris Abani, Wem Akpan, Lola Shonei, Sisi Dangoremba, A. Igoni Barrett, Ike Oguine, Chinelo Baranta, Nikki May, Buki Papillon, Aminata Fona, Nnedi Okorafor, Helen Habila, Chikayu Nigwe, E.C. Osondo, Chibundo Onozo, Oke Ndibe, Uzodimma Iwala, Teju Cole, Sefiata, and of course, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I am certain there are others I missed, including possibly obvious and canonical names. I would be grateful if you pointed them out to me. As a group, these authors, who are not prominently quoted in Fela academic discourse or featured in Felaboration and its website advertised program lineup of debates, dance competition, art exhibition, and art competition, have contributed in keeping Fela alive. In fact, not only alive, but commercially relevant in culture, consciousness, and the neoliberal marketplace, giving him what my man, the late baritone maestro Barry White, calls, quote, staying power. They are the ones in whose widely circulating and in some cases award-winning fiction, Fela's responsorial anti-apartheid lyrical phrase, Beast of No Nation, is adapted and recorded as both novel title and euphemism in child soldier narrative. They are the ones in whose storytelling his name, Fela, is severally and reverently invoked and implicitly kept alive. They are the ones in whose works his Afrobeat music is sampled, celebrated, and serves as the instigation of gendered, feminist, racial, national, continental, and Pan-African commentaries by narrators and debates among characters. They are the ones in whose creativity he functions as character, artistic inspiration, and aspiration, and in whose texts his dissident ideology and activism are modeled and memorialized. We cannot forget that Fela is the subtext of, and that his afterlife life is reified further with, every single narrative reference to the word Afrobeats and to any Afrobeats artist and musician collaboration, including their sampled lyrics in African fiction writ large. If one could track down and tally these other works and references, Fela's cameos in African fiction would quadruple, dwarfing the referential numbers for even some of the other African musical giants, particularly highlife, juju, pop, reggae, gospel, soukous, jazz, and other entertainers whose lives and works are similarly invoked in our fiction. But this African fiction gap in Fela studies, in Felabration, is not isolated. It is, to me at least, an extension or two or three or four other bigger issues. What I view as one, the persistent and gross underrepresentation of African novels in intermediate studies, sound studies, and literary jazz studies, respectively. Two, the equally persistent and similarly standardized de-emphasis of contemporary African fiction in studies and exemplifications of what Emily Peterman in her book calls the musical novel, a rubric that, while focusing on narrative form and structure in Euro-American samples, including jazz text, appears to forget the African imprint on two of jazz's most fundamental elements, polyrhythm and antiphony or call and response. Three, the persistent, inadequate critical attention paid by African literature scholars ourselves to the motif of music in African fiction, Anglophone African fiction in this case. And four, the non-existence of a published volume or two of interviews on the personal musical encounters of and/or the musical influences on our culture workers, including our creative artists and even academics. Something in the order of the Conversation with series that the University Press of Mississippi has been leading in the last several years. So great have I considered the need for that volume of interviews, and so strongly have I felt an urge to take up that project myself. Years ago, I shared my intent and rationale, but also my hindrances and frustrations with my very good friend and our colleague, Chika Okeke-Agolo. Bradle Papers founder and editor-in-chief Ainehie Doro's effort some years back to feature music-centered interviews with African writers was so refreshing. I am considering reaching out to her to collaborate on that project. It is equally gratifying to see, as just published by the Lagos Studies Association, the publication last year of Usaina Aliudo's book, Protest Arts, Gender and Social Change, Fiction, Popular Songs and the Media in Hausa Society Across Borders. If you would bear with me, I want nonetheless to probe this matter further, and we'll return in closing to the Fela cameos and Adichie's Father Amadi. But I will have to get to both tasks in a roundabout sort of way, beginning with this, my own personal backstory. I spent the past couple of days in quiet introspection on many things. Among them is the rare travel, grounding, and school closing snow and ice event across much of the Southeast, but specifically here in the capital city of Tallahassee, and on my birthday, January 22 of all days. The other musings were about circles in life. In my case, the cyclical migration, educational, professional, and familiar journeys that took me not only just from Nigeria and Africa to the great state of Florida, to the Midwest, Columbia, Missouri, and back south to Florida, but also to this very moment with you. As we might imagine, I found myself mentally preparing for this YouTube live presentation, my first. I found myself meditating on my own relationship to music, which, as with many of you, I happen to have profound passion for, an affinity and love I believe I inherited from my late father, Jacob Ochetoruchie, and may well have genetically passed on to my 3 children, Ogochukwu, Chidendo, and Chinonso. The generic ecologies of music and literary works had piqued my interest way before I encountered the word intermediality, but since my undergraduate studies in English at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, in the mid to late 1980s, at which time Fela was not just an artist and satirist extraordinary, he was also a fearless force of nature, a beacon of life and light and logic to most of us then wide-eyed college students and post-Civil War, post-oil boom, military era, shuffling and smiling Nigerians for whom and about whom and with whom he lived, sang, and devoted his life and mission. It was fascinating to me thinking too about what full circle my intellectual journey has come in many respects. For almost 40 years ago, and as a final year English major, I wrote, unlike my classmates' meager 40 to 50-page senior projects, a seminal, albeit unpublished, 175-page thesis, supervised with grateful remembrance by my teachers and scholars. First, the Harvard-trained Dr. Clement Okafor, and the first-class post-colonial scholar, Dr. Chidi Okonkwo. My subject then was a popular Igbo masquerade cult musician, Perikom Okoye of R&D Zog, my hometown. I am saddened to think that these copies of that project, which I routinely proudly overhype as my magnum opus, my first music-centered monograph, are possibly languishing, gathering the red dust of Nsukka on the departmental and university library shelves. I have in the past many years been fortunate to place essays on jazz, blues, and high life, but little did I know that 36 years later, I would find myself once again engaged in yet another extended music-focused study. I thought I was going to be writing another book, a follow-up book on Toni Morrison and Chinua Achebe. That is still planned. When I mentioned the scope of the present endeavor to our colleague, Wendy Belcher, during a brief chat at the Chinua Achebe Symposium at Princeton University a few years ago, she gasped, "Chris, that's a huge topic." I said, "I know." Imagine me. It was during my research for this study that a few light bulbs jolted me. Please bear with me. There's no question refereed monographs, chapters, articles, entries, and casual commentaries have been published on music over the years in Anglophone, Francophone, and Lusophone African literatures. However, as I started suggesting earlier, the subject of music in African fiction particularly is still, in my judgment, so critically underexplored. But it is not merely that question of understudy, but the understudy and undervaluing relative to our enormous inventory, or, if you will, our catalog or repertoire of pertinent fictional text, the truly staggering number of, in this case, canonical and non-canonical English language African novels and short stories in which the 3 categories of music that eminent musicologist Kofi Agawu has located on the continent, traditional, popular, and art music, but also diaspora and Western forms, are incorporated in minor and major ways. These musics and musical associations play significant roles in the writers and the story's context, characterizations, themes, plots, and other aesthetic innovations. Casually but curiously going to as far back as Olaude Equiano, Amos Tutuola, and Saul Plage in my unexhaustive and unsystematic tracking of the trope through the 21st century, I located over 100 of such novels. I had to suspend the effort. Not that I plan to discuss all of them in the book. Hardly. Mind you, however, this was only novels and short fiction in English language. Music, perhaps Africa's greatest export to its diaspora and its gift to the world, is so seamlessly key to African people's daily lives and to our stories and storytelling traditions. Music is so everywhere in African fiction. The critical understudy makes one want to holler in counterpoint, in both jubilee and frustration. Then something happened at last year's ALA conference in Louisville, Kentucky, that gave me another case of deja vu, and frankly, didn't help matters at all. If ALA's new president is in the audience, I ask that he please take, and I believe that he will take in good humor, what I'm about to recall. Seated close to the podium, with Research in African Literature's editor next to me, we and the rest of the association's members at the luncheon chatted, ate dinner, watched and listened intently and with occasional raucous cheers as he, minutes into his absolutely magnificent inaugural presidential address, checked off one by one the several subject areas in African literature that he urged the members to invest their critical energies and time investigating. It was a long, long list of impressive and generative topics. I knew, and I had hoped, and I had prayed silently that music, lowly music, topically unmuscular music, and sometimes critically unsexy outsider, would be duly publicly recognized, would be one of the darling topics remembered and recommended for us educators to engage with. But alas, dear Baba Fela, when the listen ended, when it stopped, the thing you called a weapon was overlooked, yet again. Feeling deflated and kind of blue, all at once, I elbowed Kwaku and whispered, no mention of music. We continued our dinner, and the beat went on. It still goes on in my mind, the polyrhythm of forks and spoons and knives clicking ceramic dinner plates, wine glasses touching teeth, appetizer saucers shuffled on vinyl tabletops, the dissonance, yet symphony of member chatter and banter, all that jazz. I finished what's left of my dinner in deep thought, but had to leave the conference soon afterwards because I had a flight to catch early the next day to return home. And we return now, circle back as it were, to Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie and Fela in preparation for landing, for my closing thoughts. In her stories, storytelling and speaking engagements, especially in her much-viewed TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie does more than mention music. She celebrates music broadly, but more specifically Nigerian, African, and African-descended musicians. She demonstrates in her fiction music's thematic reach, aesthetic possibilities, political utility, emotional necessity, and overall healing power, perhaps most notably in Purple Hibiscus, in which Fela is featured significantly as artist, outlaw, and role model. I confess that I quarreled with Adichie a little, just a little, in that forthcoming article. I note in the essay that, quote, the inescapable Black feminist pressed question of Fela's gendered complicatedness, especially his history with women, renders problematic Adichie's persistent scripting of an uncritical Fela embrace by her characters, from Amaka to Kambili, and from Ifemelu to Obinze, to the other race interrogating and Fela adoring Amaka in the short story, My American John. This latter Amaka plays Fela's song, Unknown Soldier. She once had an all-knowing white lover, John, that loved Fela Kuti. It was the reason he'd visited Nigeria and attended Nigerian events. Perhaps the reason he thought he knew how to save Nigeria, end quote. Fela's irreverent songs, anti-establishment lifestyle, and mystique enthrall Purple Hibiscus's young Amaka. His music and rebellion also enchant Americana's Obinze and Ifemelu, with the backstories of the former couple and returnees giving more complexity through music. In short, Adichie associates Fela with Amaka, Kambili, Ifemelu, and one might argue, Obinze's coming of age. However, it is in the character Father Amadi that Adichie accomplishes what I consider one of the most glaring and yet most concealed Fela refigurations in contemporary Nigerian and African fiction. She brilliantly corners and camouflages her linkages of Fela and Father Amadi, in a novel in which she skillfully deploys the technique of layering mentioned in the biopic, among several other musical elements. Let me just read verbatim what I wrote in the article. Quote, "But as apparent as Fela Father Amadi correlations are, they are routinely and surprisingly missed in Adichie scholarship. I argue that Father Amadi is Fela incarnate, or at the very least, he is invested with Fela traits. While starkly differed on marital status, both men, as people and characters, share glaring particularities. They include their positions as ministers, singers, musicians, nonconformists, anti-colonial rebels, public figures and icons that depart early at the height of their influence and fame. Father Amadi and Fela are priests, although in the case of Fela, the son of an Anglican pastor, Reverend Israel Olodotun Ransom Kuti, he is a self-styled priest of the African gods. His church worship place is the Africa Shrine, with his saints present altar where he performed animist sacrifices set up inside. Both men have followers, congregations. Purple Hibiscus's end goal is Kambali's education, both formal and informal. It is an attainment of voice, laughter, freedom, and song. Basically, inalienable human rights. The narrative design is that she will reach that summit through inescapable ultimate encounter with Fela and his revolutionary music and message, which are mediated by Amaka, Kambali's cousin, and close converts to what one might call Felaism. It is neither startling nor blasphemous, then, that many of the qualities Kambali will find attractive about Father Amadi correspond with Fela-associated attributes. That would include Father Amadi's alluring priesthood, humaneness, boyishness, charisma, shockingly unpriestly conduct, his voice and his penchant for songs and singing, for busting rhymes, so to speak. Fela sees music not just as the weapon of the future, but as a bearer of African cultural specificity in the global marketplace and culture. And there I was quoting Fela's calls. Likewise, Father Amadi appears to view music, African Igbo music and performance, as sites of culture, revolution, salvation, and learning. Notice that Kambali's chance first encounter with, and one of the indelible early memories of Father Amadi is not even from Nsukka. It was at Enugu. This was when, as a young visiting priest, and in open subversions of orthodoxies of Father Benedict's British imperialist colonialist dictates embraced by the still colonized Father Eugene, he, Father Amadi, had broken into song in the middle of his sermon. This singular act of decolonial self-assertion alarmed Eugene. It prompted him to recommend family prayer for Father Amadi because, as he recognizes in a Freudian slip, people like him were trouble for the church, for colonial institutional religion. Fela was considered an implacable troublemaker. Also admirable to Kambali is Father Amadi's intelligence, empowering attention and love of the poor. One can see Fela's magnetism, popularity, and impact on both Nigeria's youth and its larger populace mimicked in Father Amadi's embrace by and his influence on wide sections of the public. That includes the jolted and emboldened St. Agnes parishioners, Auntie Ifoma's family, Kambali and Jaja, the lecturer's children, and the families that send him dinner invitations, the disadvantaged young people from the homes and communities around the campus, whom he coaches and lifeguards, particularly the boy Ekweme, whose circumstances he finds inspirational, and even market women. Fela's death, departure, and ascension into another realm at the peak of his impact resembles Father Amadi's sudden departure from Nsukka, from his penned beloved, particularly Kambali, for his work here appears done. and so is mine in this lecture, I think. Overall, I am not asking that we set fire to the rain. What I am simply suggesting is a turntable, a turning of the table, a paradigm shift, basically that we should not merely double or triple or quadruple our current scholarly, critical, pedagogic, and programmatic investments in African fiction's musical incorporations, that we should not merely inventory, but rather rigorously unpack and reaffirm the titular, thematic, formal, and stylistic ways Nigerian novelists, African fiction writers in general, have partaken in what Derek Stanowski has called, quote, the production and consumption of Fela, end quote. The sociocultural idolization and the imaginative commemorations, conjurations, reincarnations, mythifications, and aspirational global immortalization of Fela Kuti in Nigerian, West African, African, and world history and consciousness. Perhaps that should be our takeaway from this lecture. I am hopeful for morning, for a new day, for some purple rain at dawn to irrigate back to full bloom the withering flowers that are our general critical peripheralization of the music that amazingly fills the decades-wide landscapes of African fiction. I am hopeful that as teachers, students, and fans of African literature, we will, in harmony, in concert, and like Fela Kuti, unbroken by soldiers, break the critical oversight and tirelessly agitate for music, one of the timeless subjects at the center of intermediality, our humanity and our humanities. Thanks so much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Okonkwo. That was really, really fascinating. And I've got a whole bunch of questions myself here, which I think I'm just going to check the background and see if there's anything. I don't see anything just yet, so I'm going to take the advantage of being the introducer, and I'm going to ask you the first question is simply a straightforward one. You gave a really long list of all of the folks who've referred to Fela in their novels. So the first question would simply be, what was the earliest reference that you came across in what we might call the literature?
That's a very good question. Thank you for asking it. I had to go back and look to historicize these novels. It would be Ike Ogwune's A Squatter's Tale, 2000.
2000.
Yes.
Yeah. So there is a really interesting lag then between essentially Fela's career and his being picked up in the literature.
Yes.
So I was wondering about one thing. You didn't talk about language and the fact that Fela sings in Pidgin.
Yes.
And it just struck me when I was listening to you that one of his albums is called Beast of No Nation. Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Which is a reference by Fela to an Achebe novel, because that comes out of No Longer at Ease.
No. It's not. It's not actually. It's a reference by Fela to what I believe Pete Botha of South Africa had said about South African anti-apartheid movement. He has said this beast, yes, this movement will bring the beast out in us. So Fela had taken it and made it, framed it into his song, and then also Muiwala picked it up as the title of his novel. No, it did not come from Achebe. No.
Oh, okay.
Yes,
but that phrase is there. Is it just a term of abuse in
no, it's
Nigeria at all?
No, it's the Beast of No Nation. In fact, if you go back to child soldier narratives,
yes,
of course we know that Beast of No Nation, was filmed, scripted and filmed.
Yeah.
You can go back to I think Soldier Boy,
yes.
right? This idea of child soldiers, as Beast of No Nation. But for Fela, that was his interpretation of it.
Okay, all right. So it's not, because there's definitely there's a moment in No Longer at Ease when there's I can't remember, he's a policeman, I think, and he comes across Obi Okonkwo, and he's scathing about Obi Okonkwo because Okonkwo has become sort of deracinated, I guess, because he become anglicized. And
yes,
he shouts at him, "A beast of no nation."
Yes, yes, that particular reference is about almost being in between, like almost being rootless, or former colonials. We found ourselves in between, both histories. Wandering, floundering.
Yes.
And for Obi Okonkwo, coming back from England, he was alienated.
Yes.
He was estranged from his home and, home culture. So he was straddling, cultures, couldn't quite place himself, having returned, to Nigeria from England. So in that case, it's a pejorative.
Yes.
The use of it is very pejorative, but Fela's allusion is not taken from Achebe's reference.
It's something else. Okay,
yes.
that's cute. Shoot that argument down then. But the question, my question, I think, is still relevant. Maybe trying to account for that lag between his career and his appearance in the lit. I mean, is it partly to do with linguistic snobbery?
No.
Fela is addressing very directly Nigerians because he's using pidgin, and the novelists are actually writing in a more literary language.
Not all of them. Not all of them. If you read those of them well as Beast of No Nation, it's written in what is being called rotten English.
Right.
If you go back to Ken Saro-Wiwa's Soja Boy.
Sure.
Which is actually part of the inspiration, for Zodem well. The lag that you're mentioning also has to be accounted for the resurgence of literary activity post the military era. So what you find starting with Iko Guinness, A Squatter's Tale, what is being called the third generation of Nigerian fiction, of African writers, would be signaled by a re-energization of our writers. After the moment, the military era period that, was very detrimental to writing. A lot of these poets and novelists and short story writers, went in hibernation, some were threatened, right? So it was very interesting to me that Ike Oguine's A Squatter's Tale is the first reference that I have tracked. It may well be that there's another one, that's what I'm hoping somebody in the audience, could point me to. Because this is an ongoing research.
So I actually talking about that Professor Indigirigi says, "Thank you, Chris, for filling the gap I left in my address." So he's obviously taken your comment there in good spirit. Adeleke,
yes. I'm glad he's taking it in strides.
Adeleke says, "Chris, you may add Akin Adeshokan Roots in the Sky if it's not there." And Chibo Anyaduba says, "Beast of No Nation is in Achebe's No Longer at Ease and was later used by Shoenka in Season of Anomy." The Season of Anomy is what, about 1970 something? Fela very likely took the phrase, he says, from Achebe's novel. So it's a curious thing there. When were you first, Chris, aware of Fela as a person growing up?
It was while I was still in Nigeria as a student. I grew up in the town of Aba, and as a college student, Fela was the patron saint, of student demonstrations. He lent us the energy, the language, the moral courage. So just like many Nigerians or West Africans growing up during that era, his music was everywhere.
Yes.
And I knew I had on tape, some of them, and have continued to love his music. In fact, now more that I know more about music and what he did and what he was able to accomplish in terms of the innovation, the musical innovations, because I write on jazz and blues and even high life, the other musical forms. And I can see, why he has stayed, at the top, of the game, so to speak, and it's been very influential to, artists all over the world.
Yeah. So I'm not seeing any additional questions in the chat. So again, I take advantage of being the person who's talking with you.
Sure.
And so Father Amadi.
Yes.
Very charismatic. So interesting to hear your comparisons between his appeal and Fela's and so on and so forth. But it maybe also makes us a little uneasy in terms of the fact that he's a grown man and Kambili is what, 15?
Yes.
And she seems to have this major crush on him. And can we actually talk a little bit about perhaps Fela's sexism and the exploitation, if that's the right word, of his multiple wives and backup singers and things like that? Is that something we need to pay attention to?
Well, there is no way to talk about Fela as a human being, a musician, an activist, without, talking about how complicated he is. Trying to single out any aspect of him would be very reductionist. In fact, even some feminist scholars, who have looked back at his song, Lady. I read this article where, this feminist is in Kirunzewu, I don't remember, but reclaimed that song, saying that, it's been underread in a way that a more capacious reading of that music, of that particular song, is actually very empowering, if we paid attention to it. But there is also no way to ignore the fact, of what I call Fela's complicatedness, right? His history with his wives, but also, with his history with liberating the women, because at some point he let them go, and some of them left, on their own accord. So Fela, just like a lot of other controversial musicians, in the Western world, musicians are often, highly gifted artists, are also sometimes very troubled people. We have a long history, of artists whose lives were not straight. He never claimed to be a saint, nor should we misconstrue him as one. So his life is one full of things that are very admirable, but also things that make him very human. He was very flawed. And I think it was understood, and he understood that he wasn't a perfect man. So any scholarship, any kind of engagement with Fela, will have to account with the fact that, he was fully human, capable of so much compassion, so much creativity, but also capable, of things that are not very flattering. And so when I said that in my Adichie article, I tried to point it out because, in fact, this is what I've seen across, all these novels and stories. There is an unquestioning, of that gendered aspect of Fela's relationship. And this is what I'm hoping to point out. Most of them have been very celebratory. Most of them have been very, Fela, this, but not much. In fact, until you get to Dangaremba's, this Monable Body, is Fela somehow taken to task. His position, mildly taken to task. I was surprised to find Fela in Sisi Dangaremba, especially Fela's song "Lady," that she explores there. Yes.
Yeah. So, how about Father Amadi? And actually, I'm going to back up my question with a comment that Adeyeko has come on with online. He says, maybe could we say that nativist cosmopolitanism is one more connection between Amadi and Fela? So nativist cosmopolitanism.
I would agree. I would completely agree, because that term applies to both of them. And if you really look, if you read into the text, sort of the timeline of Father Amadi's life, he would have belonged to the generation influenced by Fela. Obviously, I'm reading literature into history, but sometimes we have to do this. If you were to track his development, remember, he didn't set out to be a priest. unless I'm forgetting this in the narrative, right? Father Amadi must have been one of the Nigerians or young Nigerians. Again, this is me reading outside of the text, sort of extra textual explication.
Mm-hmm.
But he would have been, in the generation of Fela, right? When Fela was, at the peak of his influence, as a cultural force among young people. So yes, native, native cosmopolitan or cosmopolitanism, yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Good. So I'm seeing if there's any more questions in the chat, and I'm not actually seeing anything. So
maybe it goes back to my concern about I used to call them topics that are tenure and promotion, alluring topics. Nobody wants to. This is the if you were to be candid about it, this is a gap in our literature. I know so much has been published, but given the number of texts, it's like everywhere in our literature, everywhere in the novels, I was absolutely stunned. I kept finding book upon book upon book. All the musics of the world are featured in African fiction. But one of the funny things is, I think I shared this with Adeleke. I teach African American literature too. And I have not found one single African American novel in which an African musician is mentioned. But our fiction is littered with references to all manner of African American music and African American musicians. They're all over the place, Western authors, but not one.
Right.
Not one. So when this happened to me, I called him. If you ask him, he will tell you. I called him. I said, look at this. What do I make of this?
Yeah.
And he's like, go ahead and pursue it, Chris. But it's something interesting in our fiction.
Yeah.
There are authors that are sort of inward looking and outside looking, but there is not a sense of reciprocity in how the fictions from elsewhere even recognize, African musical megastars. Right? Not Franco, not Bobby Benson, not Rex Lawson, not Miriam Makeba, not Angela Akujo, not Manu Dibango, and people that would have been familiar to American audiences, not Olatunji, the great drummer. So I just found that very interesting.
Yeah. That's curious that you mentioned Dangarembwa, right? I mean, if, I don't. Where does she mentions Fela in this? Body?
Yes, this Mournable Body. Yes.
Does she also refer to any of the Zimbabwean superstars? I mean,
some, not much. No, not much. And what I found in the other literatures is how these novelists are celebrating African traditional music, gospel music, war music. And we haven't done a good job, as good a job in trying to historicize or theorize or contextualize or even aestheticize all of these references. There is nothing systematic. So somehow the book I'm working on now, which is very daunting because I've had to make certain, pragmatic choices. What do I include and what do I exclude? Maybe when it's done, God willing, it will be I don't know. The book that first tries to map, all of this, especially in English language African literature.
Yeah, but I think you're also right, Chris, in talking about the way maybe as professors we do a poor job, and we sort of narrow the field of we make our students think that there are certain things that they should be writing about. And actually, even though they may well have noticed the music references, that because we haven't put it in our curricula explicitly, they feel, oh well, that's not something for me to draw on, even though it's something they've actually noticed. So we sort of narrow things down.
Absolutely. I'm hoping, people in the audience, after this talk, will go back and reflect on this, because sometimes there's an oversaturation of certain thematics, thematic concerns in our literature. Some things are more recurrent. Obviously we have to keep it, have to keep attuned with, developments, in our field. But this is one subject that to me represents, a major, area that is still deficient, in our attention. Maybe people don't know how to talk about music, or they don't know, this interdisciplinarity of English studies and the College of Music.
Yes.
So we are so compartmentalized, so territorialized, that we don't even see, these connections.
I guess Tsitsi Jaji's
yes,
trying to move us away when we talk about African stereo and so on.
Yes, absolutely.
Very pleased to hear you refer to Aine Edoro and intermediality, because she is going to be our
next speaker,
next lecturer, right? So that's going to be terrific. There are a few comments online I can pass on to you. Leke says, in several informal discussions with the late Olaniyan, I remember us reminiscing that men of our generation learned sexism from Fela's music. And Robin Stewart puts a couple of comments. Thank you, Professor Okonkwo. I love teaching Purple Hibiscus, and thanks to you, I have more to share with my class. And also, I also agree wholeheartedly that music is essential to any discussion of African literature. So,
yes. And the comment about learning sexism from Fela, it's so interesting. He was a puzzle, and he remains. I referred to him, referencing Oriki, sort of, praising him as a descendant of Eshu, or Eshu Elebara, the great intersectionist and trickster. I think he understood his own complicatedness. And I don't think he minimized it. And he would not be dissimilar, to the other artists today. Popular music, popular artists. I mean, you look at rap and hip hop, the language is not even sanitized.
Yes.
Right? So he would not be atypical.
Yeah.
He will not be atypical, and it's not something we will hang on his neck that he did alone. But also he provided good model, for how to be a steward, of a better nation, right? He was a man who was very interested in education. He read, but also, he was very much willing to learn, to acknowledge gaps in his own knowledge. When he went to the US, this was a major turning point in his life. What if he had shut his ears to Sandra, right? What if she had said, Fela, read about Malcolm X, Fela, read about Stokely Carmichael, read about Amiri Baraka, and he said no. He could have done that. He could have, Black Power, what Black Power? So he went through a transformation that is almost close to what Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie says she did too. She learned about her Blackness when she came to the US. You see? So I completely agree with with Ade about Fela's sexism, but I think any kind of discussion of him should pay attention to that complexity.
Yes.
He was a paradox.
Well, it was interesting in the clip you played us at the beginning that one of the comments that stood out for me was how different he was on stage when he's performing than he was in person. And I think there's quite a lot hidden in that. He wasn't exactly a conventional father. There's a lot to unpack there, obviously. But plainly, there was he knew what he was doing, right, as a performer. Anyway, that's kind of curious.
And it wasn't just a performer, but also he understood the business side of music. From what I understand, some of these foreign Western multinational music labels in Nigeria were exploiting them.
Right.
Were exploiting him. You know, they were cashing in.
Yeah.
And this, you know, somebody could trace back to Bobby Benson, you know, who also understood how to blend, you know, music and commerce.
Yeah.
He was a hotelier in a way, but you know, Fela at some point, you know, realized, you know, I have to cash in on my image and my music, and my performance,
and do it his way, right? Because they were also trying to constrain it to the 3-minute single. And
absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely, and he refused. So you know, that is very remarkable.
Yeah.
You know, about him.
Yeah, Leke's just put another really interesting comment in the chat. I think this gets us back to Father Amadi and Amadi singing Igbo songs in church.
Yes.
This Nwoye in Things Fall Apart was persuaded by the poetry and music, and not by the logic, not by the message of the Christian faith. So you know, that sense of the music may not be necessarily nativist, right? But it's going to be incredibly powerful in swaying people's attitudes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you know, I'm just you know, thinking about obviously, you know, this is a weekend, and you know, many people may have been turned off because of our glitch, you know, technical glitch of 10 minutes. I just tuned out. I don't know how many people are in the audience, but you know, it also goes back to what is going on in terms of how states or even the federal government, if with the de-emphasis of certain humanities programs.
Yes.
You know, what's going on,
yes.
You know, even here in the state of Florida, and the emphasis on STEM programs.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So we have music education, you know, from, you know, pre-K to high school, you know, music programs are struggling. You know, so it's not just something that is constrained, say, to literature or to literary criticism. You know, you can trace this back to the attitude to the arts. You know, how have we responded to the arts as things that are socially, you know, socially valuable?
Yeah. You're preaching to the choir here. I mean, I think I read in one of the bio pieces on you that you were under pressure as a kid to go and be an engineer or a lawyer or a doctor. And Fela was supposed to be going off and doing his medical studies in London, right?
Yes, that is so true. And you can imagine Adichie too wanted to be a doctor, Achebe, and I mean, you can you know, list them. I was very fortunate.
Yeah.
In fact, my case was I was very fortunate because my parents, you know, never, you know, pressured me.
They didn't pressure you. Okay.
No, they did not.
Yeah.
In fact, you know, my parents before they passed on, you know, gloried in the fact that, you know, I was doing well. You know, I was doing television programs back home, and you know, all kinds of things.
Yeah.
But even though I have, you know, an older brother who's an engineer, it wasn't like you have to be like him. See, so in that way, I am eternally grateful, you know, to them, you know, for not, you know, trying to steer me to, you know, careers that I felt I didn't want to be in,
right?
Or in which I may not have had, you know, the academic strengths to pursue,
and which wouldn't allow you to fulfill your
human potential. It would not have allowed me to do that. And now, as a parent, you know, I'm extremely mindful of it.
Yeah.
You know, it's one of those things that you learn from Things Fall Apart. You know, I teach it as a parent. You know, it's absolutely interesting how Things Fall Apart is for me a guidebook in parenting.
Right.
You know, we read all kinds of things and watch TVs and read, you know, how-to books. No, read Things Fall Apart.
Yeah.
Because, you know, what you find is a typical example of trying to steer a child.
Right.
You know, and it could backfire.
And it happens in No Longer at Ease, right?
It happens in No Longer
and Eugene
and Eugene.
And who's the other big man in African lit? In Dangaremwe and
Baba Makuru.
Bamukuru. I mean, all these guys, they're not exactly model parents.
No.
They think they have the best interests of their children at heart, but they're just bullies.
Yes, that's
not a good thing.
It's not always. It doesn't always pan out, you know, the way we want it.
Well, that's we seem to be staying fairly steady at about 18 to 20 folks, but I think we may have run out. I'm not seeing any new comments in the margins here in the comments. So I think I'm just going to wrap things up, Chris, and say thank you very, very much indeed. I've thoroughly enjoyed today. I hope everybody else has online. Oops, now I see a question. Do we take music in African fiction for granted because of an assumption that the repertoire of our expressive cultures are ontologically intermedial, hence the unwillingness to focus on one? Oh, that sounds like a complicated question. Do you want to have that? Shall I read it to you again?
Go ahead, please.
All right, read it to you again so you can listen to it. Do we take music in African fiction for granted because of an assumption that the repertoire of our expressive cultures are ontologically intermedial, hence the unwillingness to focus on one?
That is deep.
That is deep. That's up to you to answer that one, Chris.
Well, I can just say that it's a very deep question, and one, that has to spur me, toward certain direction in the work, because right now I'm drafting this manuscript, parts of it, and the question that I have to contend with, is something like this.
Yes.
Right. How does this question reflect not just our criticism, but also what the authors are doing?
Yeah.
Is what I mean. So obviously, intermediality provides us, a way of seeing, all of these connections, among the media and, the expressive forms. But what is of interest to me is what our writers are doing, right, in their works relative to the musical invocations. It's not just using them as appendage,
right,
or elements of style, right? To me, there is something not just cosmologic, but something that is affirming of the music.
Yes.
To give them legitimacy.
Yes.
Right. Even when these musics are in conversation with Western forms.
Yeah.
So, you find, how as you go from place to place, these authors, some of them are doing the same thing. So you can map, a context for the musical usage, but also at some point, we should be able to, problematize some of them, especially what I mentioned about the disparity between musical references, African American literature that I've read, that is still haunting me.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask colleagues of mine who teach the literature, can you name one African American text, say from the 1960s to present, in which an African musician, or even African music is referenced? I don't know what to make of it, just as I don't know what to make, of this profound question, that the member of the audience just posed. But I will definitely think about it, because, it is going to push me, to complicate the argument even more.
Well, do you have a colleague there at FSU who's an African ethnomusicologist, can help you?
Oh, yeah. Actually, well, it's so interesting. I referenced one of our star graduate students, Alaba Ileshami. He's also an emerging Fela scholar. He's writing this dissertation that's probably going to get him a job right away. And in a week, I'm moderating a symposium, out of the College of Music. Because,
very cool.
Yes, because here at FSU, our dean, Dean Sam Huckabee, promotes interdisciplinarity. He wants us to see ourselves not as bifurcated, territorialized, fields of study, but for us to showcase, our interconnections. So, that interdisciplinarity, will give me the opportunity to, maybe, inquire about this. But I wanted to start with my colleagues.
Yeah.
Who are African Americanist, right? Especially those in poetry and those in fiction. Have you seen any? because I don't know what to make of it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, not that they should, but it was just so glaring to me that not one, but then our literature, our fiction is so full of all these references.
Yeah.
You know, maybe also has to do with, because our writers have lived overseas, American culture has superseded British culture in terms of our consciousness.
Yeah.
The
But
music we
underlying all
listen.
the music is African music. Every single, I mean, without African music, the soundtrack of the 20th and 21st century falls completely silent.
Right. So just to say this, I do want to thank you again for invitation to speak. I do thank everybody that logged in from all parts of the world. I do thank everybody that posed a question or made a comment. I will take all of these in, and thanks to our president for not striking my name off membership. But when that happened, I told I told Kwaku, I'm like, no, he didn't say it.
Yeah.
He didn't say it.
Adichie has added a comment, by the way, in response to James's question. He says recognizability, perhaps. And I'm going to just, I will just, you don't have to answer this question, but this is, James has given a follow-up, which perhaps can leave you and everybody in the audience to think about too. Just with the shift from oral performances / tradition to print and the novel in mind, is the reluctance to talk about music an assertion of indigenous aesthetic that resists the Western literary form itself? So that's another angle. To think about that it's actually it's not something we should be doing.
Well, it's so very interesting because I did mention how we are underrepresented, and this is a matter for African Literature Association to take on, because we have to be able to not steer but encourage scholarship.
Yeah.
Right. We have to look at the full range of thematic possibilities. But I was referencing our underrepresentation in sound studies, in literary jazz studies, in intermediate studies, and what is now called the musical novel. A colleague of mine and I are editing an anthology of fiction anthology of music fiction from all over the world, with the goal of at least publishing the underrepresented text.
Yeah.
We couldn't get one on African literature.
Huh.
Nobody sent in an abstract.
That's still, a shame.
In fact, I had to contact a couple of weeks ago. I sent out, new solicitations. We have this CFP, and everybody, I don't have time, I'm sorry, and not one. See, not one. So, it goes back to sometimes Western musical conventions, have been, if you will, superimposed,
right,
on our novels. So one of the tasks that we have is, how do we begin to define, what our texts are doing?
Yeah.
Without having to go to the sonata, to the classical music, the fugue, all these literally, Western musical terms, that we are forced to appropriate to talk about what our works are doing. So for me, the question is, when we talk about the musical novel, how does the African novel fit into it? Especially if you are talking about, our works in which music permeates. Does the African novel's incorporation of musical styles or musical subjects, does it force us to rethink the notion of the musical novel?
Yeah.
Because much of it, the texts that are used are Western forms, classicals and jazz and, sometimes blues. But then the continent is, the continent has, this, in our indigenous language, traditions, even in French and Portuguese, there's abundant, if you will, scholarship on music in Francophone literature. Because, but also I think there could be more. I'm not an expert in that field, but I know they've probably done more
Interesting.
than we have in Anglophone.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Chris, you've given me tons to think about, and maybe in Nairobi in June we can continue this conversation.
Yes, unfortunately, I'm not gonna be in Nairobi.
You're not gonna be there. Oh,
no, but I'm gonna be there in spirit because I'll be teaching summer school, and you know, I'm not gonna be able to make it, but my spirit will be there with you all. And thanks to Lexi, you know, and everybody that helped make this possible.
Yeah,
it's absolutely wonderful. It was fun, a pleasure.
Great. I really enjoyed it. So please, everybody, don't miss the next lecture, which is in March. Ainehi Idoro, Intermediality on digital online publishing and so on. I mean, she's doing a wonderful job with Brittle Paper, really expanding the kinds of things that we talk about in African Lit. So make sure you're there March the 22nd. And then those of you who can make it to Nairobi, please note that the conference details are now live on africanlit.org. So if you have not registered yet, please go ahead and register and do all of that sort of stuff. But right now, thank you very much in the audience. Thank you very much, Lexi, for organizing things in the backstage. And most particularly of all, thank you, Dr. Okonkwo, for a really, really lively and entertaining and thought-provoking lecture.
Thanks so much.
Farewell from me.
All right, same here. Cheers.
Okay, bye-bye. Are we offline now, Lexi?